Hello, I'm David R. Jones of the Community Service Society. New York City's proposed budget has a shortfall of almost $5 billion. Mayor Bloomberg has announced his plans to trim almost $2 billion by cutting city services and has stated his objection to a city council proposal to raise taxes. Our subject today is raising taxes in New York City. Joining me now is Edmund McMahon, Senior Fellow at the Center for Civic Innovation at the Manhattan Institute, and James Parrott, Deputy Director and Chief Economist of the Fiscal Policy Institute. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you. Thank you.
Before we get into the meat of this program, talking about potentially raising taxes, how did we get a $4.7 billion or $5 billion budget deficit? I'll start with you.
Well, we didn't get it entirely from September 11th. Basically, the big way we got it was that inevitably the city government's appetites caught up with its food supply, basically. In the early years of the Giuliani administration, there were significant cutbacks in spending. I think everybody remembers that. City budget didn't grow at all, even nominally a few years. However, there were a lot of expenses built into some of the collective bargaining agreements that Mayor Giuliani made in the mid-90s, and then later on he added to the city payroll significantly. And what happened was that while these surpluses were developing, there was also a big tide, a big wave of spending developing. And in fact, in Mayor Giuliani's last budget, before 9/11, there was basically a $2 billion operating deficit in that budget, which was papered over with surplus funds. That's why there was a big budget gap forecast for next year, even before the World Trade Center attack. The World Trade Center attack, Mayor Bloomberg says, is responsible for $2 billion of the problem.
The other thing we've got to keep in mind is that over the last few years, the city has cut taxes to a significant extent, and about 2/3 of the structural deficit that existed pre-September 11th is a result of a variety of tax cuts that the city has pushed through. On the premise that the economy would keep growing and that the revenues would be there in order to fund city services, we now see that that was not a good assumption.
Now, Mayor Bloomberg, certainly a businessman running city government, unique in perhaps many ways, has put forward a proposal for rather deep spending cuts and only limited taxation. I guess there are taxes involved in his proposal, by the way. Starting with you, Jim, what is this? Do you feel this is an equitable way to balance the city budget with these size of expense cuts?
This is really, when you look at the total size of the gap, is unprecedented in city's fiscal history. You'd have to go back to the 1975 fiscal crisis to find something as severe. I think under the circumstances and given the limited time that the mayor had, he put together a reasonable attempt, although I don't think it's really as balanced, that it's a balanced way to balance the city budget, and he's not really looking for all important groups in the city to really share in the burden of balancing this budget. He didn't look very extensively at the tax side. He said that because this is an election year in Albany and the city needs the approval of the state in order to put through any tax increases except the property tax, he basically left that off the table. I think that's an area that's got to that we have to look at further, and that's what we're here today to talk about.
Mm-hmm. Ed?
Well, I think the mayor was correct in not calling for a broad-based tax increase, although, as you noted, he's got a tax increase in there. He has this big cigarette tax increase, which would be a little mini disaster of its own in some ways, economically and from a law enforcement standpoint.
But it would save lives, wouldn't it?
What it would do is it would create enormous new opportunities for criminal behavior throughout New York. It would become so profitable to sell a pack of cigarettes, which is something that's legal to own and to use for anybody above the age of 18, that you'd have enormous problems. But aside from that, there's already been a broad-based tax increase in New York, and that's something people don't like to pay attention to, but came in between the cracks at the end of last year. Last year, all residents of New York City paid less city income tax than they will pay this year. And that happened because of a glitch in the way the state law extending a city income tax surcharge was drafted due to a dispute between the former mayor and the legislature. It had nothing to do with 9/11 initially. Then afterwards, it became a convenient excuse, and everybody just kind of looked the other way. And taxes have gone up, and they've gone up considerably. The total revenue gain from this is over $300 million. There was supposed to be another incremental cut this year. So in fact, we've already had a tax increase. We've already had a fairly fateful reversal of the policies of the last few years. And I think the mayor is correct in recognizing that it's got to stop there. I think that one of his reasons for doing this is not just pragmatic politics of recognizing that Albany doesn't want to do anything in an election year. I think he recognizes, and he said repeatedly, that we can't afford to give people an excuse to leave New York at this sensitive time.
Well, Jim, you raise this issue, and I'll get back to Ed's point about can this drive business away. But what about the mayor's rationale that basically Albany wouldn't touch this in an election year, that it's just not, won't have any traction?
That's basically a perspective that says that it's politics as usual this year. And this comes at a time when all elected officials in New York have been going to Washington saying this is an unprecedented circumstance. New York City bore the brunt of this military attack in the United States. We need help. New York City and New York State are facing sizable budget deficits. To treat this as an ordinary election year and defer to, quote, politics as usual, I think doesn't reflect the sort of leadership that the city and the state need.
But you saw, as well as I did, the two Democratic candidates have come out against any tax increases. Does that indicate there's going to be any traction here?
That's certainly not a promising development, but I think the city council and the mayor are the ones that are going to have to put forward a clear perspective on how they're going to balance the city budget, and to do that in a balanced way that includes some tax increases, and take that to Albany and insist that the political leaders in Albany sit down and help the city resolve its budget deficit, because that's critically important to the state revenue picture. The city's economy and the downstate economy account for 2/3 of state revenues. The state has an obligation to help the city solve its fiscal problem and help the city in every way it can to get the economy going again.
Now, Ed, you talked about the potential of driving business out. We and a number of other progressive groups commissioned a poll, which seemed to be pretty convincing that because of 9/11, actually, people were willing to consider new taxes if it could be targeted appropriately for children and education. Is it inevitable that if you come up with new targeted, time-limited tax increases, that it'll drive business screaming from the city?
Well, the poll you're referring to, and all the polls I've seen, confirm what we know about a lot of polls like this, which is that if you give people the impression that they have a choice between a service cut potentially and a tax increase for somebody who makes more than they do, the answer is go ahead and raise taxes. I do think it would be damaging, and I think it's important to create a context for this. Let's keep in mind how high taxes are in the city. This is the highest tax big city in the United States, and by most measures, nobody else is even close. It's not a small marginal difference. It's a huge difference, even after the tax cuts of the last few years. And that difference is particularly pronounced if you're a middle-class family in New York. The burden of major state and local taxes is significantly higher than it is in other major cities. And the difference between New York and other big cities in the country and the biggest cities in other states gets bigger as income goes up. In other words, the difference is about 25 to 30% for a family making $75,000 a year, which for a couple in New York is squarely in the middle class. If you go up to $150,000 a year, which is the threshold of really what would be considered upper income in New York, the gap is bigger than 50%. We have a very, very heavy tax burden here. We have a combined corporate income tax rate of over 17% in New York City. There's no state that comes close to that. Our combined income tax rate in New York City, state and city, is 10.5%. Now, it's better than it used to be. It's not nearly as bad as it was years ago. But that's very high. It's much higher than neighboring jurisdictions. And even after you adjust for the deductibility on federal returns and the like, this is a problem for New York. Now, taxes aren't the only factor that determine where people live and work. If they were, there'd be nobody living in New York who made more than $40,000 or $50,000 a year because they'd find an advantage elsewhere. But at a certain point, these marginal increases become very damaging. And that's the point of the context.
We have to keep in mind that the real reason why the tax burden is high in in New York City is because the state requires localities, and in particular New York City, to bear much more of the Medicaid and the public assistance burden than other states require of their local governments. If you factor that out, the margin by which taxes are higher in New York City is not that much above the national average. Secondly, when you look at the combined state and local tax burden relative to income in New York, I wish I had brought a chart that we have that shows this very clearly. For low-income groups, it's a much higher percent than it is for high-income groups. And it's only 9% for high-income groups. So that suggests that if we want to make the tax burden more evenly shared in New York City, that we need to bring the people in the upper end up.
And isn't it true when you talk to business, it's a mix of things that keep them here? Obviously, they're more concerned about deteriorating educational situation and the inability to get, competent workers, as well as other things that make the city very unpleasant, particularly at one point, rising crime and other social dysfunction. And clearly, the cutbacks in social services may inevitably lead to that if we're not careful, considering how many unemployed people we seem to be getting in the city of New York.
Well, I think it's important to recognize that again, yes, it's not invalid to recognize that there are other factors besides taxes that are in the mix with businesses. But when all things are considered equal, when you've got everything in the mix, taxes are a very big factor. They're a big part of business costs. They permeate, they're pervasive. They're a big reason why it's so expensive to live and work and run a company here. And when you talk about education being important, yes, it is. But the fact is we've made an enormous investment in K-12 education in New York City in recent years. There's been huge increases in our spending on that. And we're not getting any results, certainly not the positive gains that we should be getting if you were to accept the claims that are often made that money equals progress. I think that people understand also that the simplistic claim that simply pouring more money into a lot of these problems without reforming the processes and the programs that we're talking about is not necessarily the solution. And while Jim made the point about our taxes being driven largely by state mandates, which is largely true, the fact is that's the situation we're dealing with. We'd still be higher taxed, I think, than any major city, big city in America except Philadelphia, even if you took away the Medicaid mandate, for instance.
But it would only be slightly higher.
But it would still be the highest tax jurisdiction in the metropolitan area, and that's the competition directly.
The real problem here, I think, starts with the state. The state has a budget deficit this year of $5 to $6 billion. Over the last 7 years, the state, the governor, and the legislature combined have cut taxes by $15 billion. Were it not for that overzealous tax cutting, we would have a different fiscal situation at the state level. The state would be in a much better position to help localities all around the state that are facing fiscal pressures, including New York City.
We'll be right back to continue the Urban Agenda.
Adam has a disease that's making him tired, stunting his growth, and breaking down his immune system. A disease affecting over 12 million children. A disease that's totally curable. It's called hunger. Second Harvest is America's food bank network. Just call your local food bank to help.
Welcome back to the Urban Agenda. We're talking about raising taxes in New York City. I'm joined by Edmund McMahon from the Manhattan Institute and James Parrott of the Fiscal Policy Institute. Gentlemen, we were getting into the whole question of what about the state and its responsibilities to provide some services here. Ed, you were...
Well, I would in general agree with Jim, just on the general point that the state is a big problem here. I would disagree probably almost entirely on what parts of the problem are the worst parts. If you've worked in Albany as I have, you get really disgusted with what goes on there at close remove. There's been a lot of cynicism, not to mention disingenuousness in the legislature. What the legislature and the state did to the city in the late 1990s and in the last few years was even outrageous, even by the usual standards of Albany. And I don't refer just to things such as the repeal of the commuter tax, which I don't take as a net negative. We can discuss that, but as not giving the city the choice over its own tax policy. But there's issues such as the mandated increase in pension benefit costs, which will cost well over $500 million, which was simply stuck on the city without a single thought for how the city could afford it. The timing of the state's decision to simply walk away from the $114 million a year in so-called stock transfer incentive aid. It's a technical term, but it was $114 million a year that had been coming from the state to the city for a long time. And in the wake of 9/11, to add $500 million to the state budget, which is what they did, and to take out $114 million for the city of New York, that's just a classic Albany maneuver.
Before we go on, is this some kind of suicide? The state economy, by all measures, absent New York City, is behind Mississippi in growth rate. I mean, what's going on here? What is New York State doing here?
I mean, it's not that simple because because of the there's the whole metro area, but the metro area and its suburbs obviously are intertwined with the city, and it all grows from there. There's always been an incredible level of deniability in Albany about the effect of their policies on the city. One of the things the city suffers from is too much government, not just at City Hall, but basically in New York City you have two state governments in effect. You have the city of New York, which is like a state, and levies has a whole array of programs and taxes just like a state, like a big state. And then you have the whole state that's based in Albany, which has a layer on top of that. And which has the authority to make decisions for the city. That's a big problem.
Jim?
Albany was watching New York City and seeing that the city's economy in the aggregate was doing very well. And the city itself it has an extensive tax structure, as we all know. It was generating a lot of revenues. The state saw that situation and thought that they could take from the city and redistribute some of that upstate, because the upstate economy has been faltering for years and years and years. It never really picked up and shared in the national expansion in the 1990s. And I think we need to hold Albany accountable for not putting together a serious economic development plan to help revitalize the upstate economy. But getting back to the city and the state, the situation now obviously is much different than what it was in 1988 and 1999. The state can't sit back and expect that the city is going to be able to generate its own resources to take care of the situation. As I said before, it's absolutely vital to the state's revenue situation and the state budget in order to help the city in every way possible to get back on sound fiscal footing. The state should be looking for ways to help the city doing this, to do this, and I think reinstating the commuter tax would be a logical, sensible first step to do that, as well as going further than that and allowing the city to increase to restore a surcharge on the personal income tax, and even consider such things as a temporary restitution of the stock transfer tax, a tax that would enable all participants in the financial markets to contribute to the rebuilding of Lower Manhattan and New York City's economy.
Well,
obviously, you don't agree with
no,
this.
I mean, I think that's like asking Albany for permission give the city permission to slit its own throat, which unfortunately Albany is almost all too willing to do in some circumstances. Look, I mean, talking about the commuter tax, we can get into the pros and cons of that, but the point is, there's a larger amount of money potentially in the long run tied up in another issue that no one talks about, that also is in Albany's control, and that's tort reform. Giuliani talked about this for years, and he was right. The city in damage claim awards paid out $549 million. $549 million. Mayor Bloomberg had a chart at his preliminary budget presentation. It was just priceless. I've never seen it presented this way before. He had New York City and New York State in terms of the damage awards against them for damage claims, for torts. The city was $549 million. The state is $84 million. Now, the state of New York has a bigger public university system, the biggest in the country. It has 3 major academic medical centers and the highway system and everything else and prisons. Why is the state so much lower than the city? Because the state has laws in place to protect itself from excessive runaway jury awards. Among other things, you can only sue the state in the state court of claims. Now, the city for years has been looking for something that would give it treatment similar to what the state has, so it wouldn't be looked at as this deep pocket for this lawsuit bonanza. You never hear anybody talking about pushing that agenda in Albany. Now, part of the reason is that the trial lawyers are very powerful in Albany. They're thought to have a veto over that. But in fact, that's something that would really help the city, and it's really outrageous, and it's really a waste.
That clearly is a long-term intervention. What about short-term revenue supports?
Well,
is it only going to have to be on the expense side?
I think short-term. I think short-term that there are things the state could do that, again, we're not hearing enough talk about. For instance, and perhaps it'll emerge from these talks that are going on about how whether the mayor's control of the Board of Ed. Another thing the state has been doing that actually hurts the city, along with other localities, is that they've converted more and more of their school aid, even before they begin reducing that aid, into what are called categoricals. They give you the money, but they say you have to spend it this way or that way. You have to spend it to reduce class size, or in the case of Albany more recently also, you got to spend it on pre-K classes. They ought to disentangle those categoricals. They ought to convert more of the aid back into just a broad stream of operating aid that the city and its community districts can use in the way that's most effective for them. It also doesn't help, and Albany should be reversing things such as aspects of this new massive blockbuster healthcare reform act package, which also have costs for the city, because what they do is they increase the Medicaid costs that the city stuck with to begin with. Another issue you don't hear much about, but the mandates that Jim was talking about that drive up taxes, they've been made more and more expensive by Albany. Those are things that you could, in the short term, reverse those issues. In terms of revenue support, the phrase you use, I mean, I disagree. Again, I think that's just giving the city permission to cut its own throat.
Jim?
Clearly, I think it's time for the state to start exploring how it can finance a takeover of Medicaid expenses and impose some controls, such as the state setting up a purchasing system to purchase pharmaceutical drugs. Other states have been starting to do this. There's significant potential savings there for both the city and the state if they were to do that. I think the state has to look at its own tax structure. As I said before, it's cut $15 billion in taxes. And when we look at what we've gotten in exchange for that, did we get the sort of economic revitalization that the governor promised when he proceeded to cut the state personal income taxes by 25% back early in his first term? We didn't see that economic revitalization upstate. I don't think anybody would attribute the economic prosperity that the city saw to the reduction in the state income tax. That economic prosperity was heavily driven by the boom conditions on Wall Street and the media sector and so on.
Let's just talk briefly about the issue of, no new immediate revenue. What do you envision is going to happen to the city of New York? We have 7.2% unemployment now. We have over 30% unemployment in certain categories of black and Latino kids. We're likely to see much higher rates because of 9/11, 138,000 jobs lost. How does the city keep its quality of life going with huge upsurges in unemployment and joblessness among very vulnerable populations?
Well, before I get into that, I just answer one thing
sure.
because Jim said nobody would suggest. I would disagree on that also. And in fact,
Ed will suggest, right?
I will suggest. Lest I be seen as too negative on Albany. I do think the state tax cuts help New York. In fact, if upstaters had a beef, a lot of the state tax cuts that were done, especially 95 through 98 or so, had particular benefits for the city. When you cut income taxes, you do a lot of help for the city because the city and its surroundings are where the income is. The elimination of the estate tax, which now technically is being rolled back, unfortunately, for other reasons, was something that helps the city, again, because of the concentration of wealth and high-income estates here, driving fewer people out. The business tax cuts, the other cuts that were done in Albany, the cuts in the real estate transfer tax, these things all, and the cuts in the state hotel tax, early in Pataki's tenure, these things all help the city disproportionately, and I think they were a part of the city's regrowth. Now, getting to your question, I think that the city's main challenge is to deal with the issues you talked about, which is the economic effects of the economic downturn as exacerbated by the World Trade Center collapse, without panicking, without doing something that makes it worse. I think that whenever there's an economic downturn, there's a temptation to say that, well, there are more people with needs, we need to spend more. I think the problem is that we've done that in the past, and it's had disastrous results. Not just in the late 80s and early 90s, but if you go back to the late 60s and early 70s, there was a big downturn, there was a bear market, there was a national recession. The city responded by dramatically raising taxes and continuing to spend a lot, not to mention borrow. And what happened was the city lost 500,000 jobs then. That syndrome was repeated in the early 90s when the city lost 300,000 jobs and had basically practically a depression while the nation was having a brief recession.
Jim?
Well, I guess when you look at the relationship between taxes and jobs, I guess there are different ways to look at the causality there. EJ is suggesting that you raise taxes, you lose jobs. I think if you look carefully at both the 1970s and the 1989 to 92 downturn and the fiscal pressures in both of those periods, the causality was the other way. We lost jobs. The city, in order to maintain vital services, resorted to raising taxes. Now, it probably would have been better off if there had been a more balanced approach working with the state in doing that. I certainly do see that there are limits to how much the city can raise taxes, but I think fundamentally that was not the cause of those economic problems. It's due to broader forces in the economy. That's what's going on now too. The mayor is concerned. He said that if we raise taxes, we might drive people away, might drive businesses away. I think it's better to look at the importance of quality public services, good education system, good public health care system, and so on.
I'm sure we're going to have a lot more to discuss over the coming year. But thank you, gentlemen, both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My thanks to Edmund McMahon and James Parrott for joining us today. The prospect of higher taxes in New York City is not something that anyone would look forward to, but it may be necessary in order to meet the essential needs of all New Yorkers. Raising taxes must be one of the possibilities considered. We must look at the revenue and the expense side of the budget. To look at only expenses without considering revenue is neither appropriate nor responsible. I'm David R. Jones of the Community Service Society. Thank you for watching The Urban Agenda.
To comment on the Urban Agenda or for more information on CSS, contact Community Service Society of New York, 105 East 22nd Street, New York, New York, 10010. Area code 212-254-8900.